Okay, got our last section, Capital Volume 1. Hooray. So, get started with Chapter 30, Impact of the Agricultural Revolution on Industry, Creation of a Home Market for Industrial Capital. So, I guess a quick overview of this. Piece it together from the title mostly. And he's already alluded to what he's going to talk about in this chapter and previous chapters, but one of the one of the first things that has to happen to get capitalism started is displacing workers or producers from the land, or like he'll say, like, removing them from the soil or whatever. And he ties at least part of that process to the agricultural revolution, where it's pretty simple. Here, I guess let's jump into the quote here. He says, well, pause a moment on this element of primitive accumulation. The thinning out of the independent, self-supporting peasants corresponded directly with the concentration of the industrial proletariat, in the way that Jeffrey Saint whatever, explained the condensation of cosmic matter. Okay, so Marx being. But this was not the only consequence. In spite of the smaller number of its cultivators, the soil brought forth as much produce as before, or even more, because the revolution in property relations on the land was accompanied by improved methods of cultivation, greater cooperation, higher concentration of the means of production, and so on. And because the agricultural wage laborers were made to work at a higher level intensity, the field of production on which they worked for themselves shrank more and more. With the setting free of a part of the agricultural population, therefore, their former means of nourishment were also set free, and now they're transformed into material elements of variable capital. Peasant, expropriated and cast adrift, had to obtain the value of the means of subsistence. New lord, the industrial capitalist, in the form of wages. And the same thing happened to those raw materials of industry depended on indigenous agriculture. They were transformed into an element of constant capital. So this is like the thesis statement of this chapter, basically, right? So we already know from, I think, some of the earlier, like the chapters right before this, there was, a commensurate like industrialization of agriculture happening. At the same time, you've got industrialization of manufacturing. So the consequence of that, just like in industry or manufacturing, is you are cutting back on the number of workers that you need at any given time. In other words, he calls it setting free a part of the agricultural population, which is sort of a double entendre a little bit, because you're setting them free in terms of like, hey, you're free from your former job, but now you're also free to sell yourself back into wage slavery. That's the only way to feed yourself. So that's pretty much the idea, right? Is that these newly set free workforce becomes variable, or like able to be exploited by variable capital, and the raw materials of the crops and stuff that they're growing are no longer used in like direct consumption, or they're not being used to, make your own food, make your own clothes or housing, or just or even like carpentry, something like stuff like that. You're not really doing that for yourself anymore. You're not self-supporting. You are just working for a wage, and instead, you have to you have to use your wage to go to the market and buy all that stuff for yourself. Hence the creation of a home market. That's what that means, right? So this is all kind of a consequence of agricultural revolution that's happening kind of parallel alongside the industrial revolution. All right. Yeah, I was gonna say, footnotes usually got all the references he makes, literary or otherwise. And then if you see an asterisk like this, that's the translator of the text. So like asterisk is translation. The 1 and 2 is like either Marx's or Engels' footnote. One of them. All right. So had a little bit here. All right. The events that transformed the small peasants into wage laborers and their means of subsistence and of labor to material elements of capital created at the same time a home market for capital. Formerly, the peasant family produced means of subsistence and raw materials, which they themselves, for the most part, consumed. These raw materials and means of subsistence have now become commodities. The large scale farmer sells them and he finds his market in the manufacturers. So, right, I mean, if you're a farmer, you're not like selling to your neighbors or I don't know. It's not like a farmer's market where you're just selling straight to people who are like buying food or products to eat or use immediately. Now you're selling your products to like a big old honking manufacturer. So like maybe not foodstuffs necessarily. Although modern day it would be you'd probably most farmers probably do sell to like giant food processing corporations and stuff like that. Yeah, and PepsiCo and Coca-Cola, Kroger, like all of them, Walmart, all the good ones. But um, yeah, it's you're selling your stuff as commodity for the purposes of being sold once again instead of directly consumed. Yeah, and nowadays I think the only time we do see that is like it's in the name, right? A farmer's market. Like modern day small farmers markets are pretty much the last remnants of that older style of like you buying directly from the farmer through the food. So, there's little traces of what used to be still around, but clearly the dominant procedure is just like he describes. Just you're selling straight to a manufacturer or like food processor or something like that. Or just a giant retail chain, basically. All right. Yarn, linen, coarse woolen stuffs, things whose raw materials have been within the reach of every peasant family, have been spun and woven by the family for its own use, are now transformed into articles of manufacture, and the markets for which are found precisely in the country districts. Previously, a small mass of producers working on their own account had found their natural counterpart in a large number of scattered customers. Now these customers are concentrated in one great market provided for by industrial capital. Thus, the destruction of the subsidiary trades of the countryside, the process whereby the manufacturers divorced from agriculture, was hand in hand with the expropriation of the previously self supporting peasants and their separation from their own means of production. And only the destruction of rural domestic industry can give the home market of a country that extension and stability which the capitalist mode of production requires. So that's pretty much how you substitute, and this is sort of a theme with these couple of chapters I noticed is that Marx is sort of doing like a bit of a historical account of which I'll get to in a little bit, but like this kind of first negation is what he sort of calls it, of the negation of the sort of formerly understood idea of private property by the capitalist understanding of private property, which are two different things. Um, so not to get ahead of myself too much, but I'll just give a quick explanation of what those two are. So the individual private property is sort of like you are the owner of that which you produce. That is pretty much individual private property. Of like, if you cultivate your land and you get a bunch of produce from it, that is your private property. I guess the land technically would be too, but as like a means of production. Um, but similarly, even if it doesn't have to be just food, it could be like he says, um, linen, wool, yarn, like upholstery, or what's it called, textiles, all that fun stuff. If you were like hand weaving stuff, that's also your private property because you made it. Um, Capitalist private property, of course, is a bit different because now we're talking about a capitalist purchasing that which somebody else makes in the form of they're purchasing it with a wage. Their person is selling their products because they have got nothing to eat. Basically, they gotta get money somehow. Um, so yeah, that's kind of like a slight inversion there, but we'll see what he means later. All right. Okay. From the last third of the 15th century, we find continual complaints, only interrupted at certain intervals, about the encroachment of capitalist farming in the country districts and the progressive annihilation of the peasantry. But on the other hand, we always find that this peasantry turns up again, although in diminished number, in a progressively worse situation. Chief cause is this: England is at certain epochs mainly a corn growing country, and at others a cattle breeding country. They alternate, and the alternation is accompanied by fluctuations in the extent of peasant cultivation. A consistent foundation for capitalist agriculture could only be provided by large scale industry in the form of machinery. It is large scale industry which radically expropriates the vast majority of the agricultural population and completes the divorce between agriculture and rural domestic industry, tearing up the latter's roots, which are spinning and weaving. So, right at the same time, you are increasing your agricultural output. You're also increasing the industrial output of, like, machine based spinning and weaving, uh, automatic looms and all that stuff. So not all, like, now the handmade market, like, they literally just can't compete. Um, on top of uh, like the agriculture becoming more productive. So it's kind of like a two pronged approach here. Yeah, I think yeah, the chapter right before this, the Genesis of the Capitalist Farmer, um, is pretty much about that, right? So it's like, yeah, capitalist farmers basically hiring more like displaced peasants to be their hired hands to work their fields for them. And since they are capitalists, you know, once they accumulate enough capital, they can just purchase more land, and keep expanding their operation and so on and so forth. So now you've got like a whole bunch of land owned by not very many people, and the people who used to own the land are now working the land instead. Um, but but then this chapter kind of comes in next, and Marx says, okay, that was like part one. Part two is now there's a bunch of new agricultural techniques and technology and whatever that's increasing production, and just like before, that displaces peasants too. It kicks them, hey, we don't need as many hands this year because our new machine can, harvest way more efficiently or whatever. So you just kick them out, right? All kinds of stuff. And yeah, those peasants got to do something to live, so they probably, leave the countryside, go move into the cities, and look for work there. All right. Next. Oh, go ahead. It's true. And also, I think, like, I kind of get now why the David Harvey schedule suggests chapters 26 through the end of the book, like, all in one go. Because they're kind of all relatively short chapters with a lot of historical context for, you know, uh, like Marx is sort of walking us through like the real world historical example of what he already analyzed earlier, where he does all of his abstract analysis ahead of time, and then he says, okay, now let's look at the actual history of the situation, and we'll see how the analysis, like lines up with the reality pretty much. So yeah, these last few chapters all kind of read like more like just straight history and kind of like one long story pretty much. That's kind of how they read to me, at least. Okay, so now we got 31 here, which is another kind of important chapter. And I know we get this question in the damn server like pretty frequently still to this day. Which is sort of like, oh, like how did capitalism start? Yeah, like we all kind of understand how it works, or at least you kind of get the basics. But how do you go from like a feudal society into capitalist system, capital society? Like what happened there? This chapter is probably the most succinct, even though I think chapters 26 through 32, maybe 33, are kind of all answering that question because there's a lot of answers. But yeah, I think chapter 31 is like the most succinct because man, Marx really tears into him. This one. All right. Uh, did you get a new job then? Okay. Yeah. All right. Gotcha. All right. Well, glad we have you for at least a little bit. All right. I guess I'll just here. All right. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the indigenous population of that continent, the beginnings of the conquest and plunder of India, and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of blackskins are all things which characterize the dawn of the era of capitalist production. So yeah, next time somebody in the server asks, how did capitalism get started? This is one absolute ripper of a one sentence answer, which is pretty damning, obviously. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. So there we go. Like, if you want kind of like the short and brutal answer to what is primitive accumulation, it's basically the worst shit imaginable. Hard on their heels follows the commercial war of the European nations, which has the globe as its battlefield. Begins with the revolt of the Netherlands from Spain, assumes gigantic dimensions in England's anti-Jacobin war, and is still going on in the shape of the Opium Wars against China, etc. So, etc., and kind of Mark's answer, in his answer or brief description of primitive accumulation, he's suggesting this is still happening, by the way. And I think even to this day, primitive accumulation still does happen. And then I guess another thing is, if anyone watched the David Harvey lecture, he also brings up this idea of accumulation by dispossession, which is sort of a more modern version of primitive accumulation, in the sense that it's just not as primitive. Basically, it's a little more systematic and targeted and extremely violent, but still very violent. Um, because of course that's what dispossession means, right? You are just being like, well, you know, the whole world has basically been carved up by um, competing capitalist nations, more or less. Therefore, the only way to get access to new resources and new markets or new workforces or whatever, you're probably going to go have to take it from somebody else, right? You're going to have to accumulate by dispossessing what you're after from somebody who already has it. Um, and I mean, that has honestly, it has a ton of parallels with primitive accumulation as Marx describes it. So, I mean, David Harvey makes it sound like it's kind of a different process, but to me, it sounds like it's very, very much the same process. Because really, I mean, if we're talking about like colonization of the Americas, the slave trade in Africa, conquest of India, like, I mean, I'm like, these are all technically still dispossessing somebody of something, right? Whether you're just straight up throwing people into slavery, you're dispossessing them of basically all bodily autonomy. You're just genociding people so you can have their land, which is kind of like dispossession. Or or just like a combination of, stealing people's land or enslaving them and putting them to work and stealing their shit. It's like, it's all dispossession, basically, right? There's not that much of the earth that is truly like never been contacted by human beings, that has truly just been able to be like, hey, I'm the first guy to find this and I'm just going to take it. Yeah. So anyways, just a interesting thought I had, I guess, listening to the lecture. Okay. Actually, just wanted to read the next paragraph because stuff in here. All right. The different moments of primitive accumulation can be assigned in particular to Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England in more or less chronological order. These different moments are systematically combined together at the end of the 17th century in England. The combination embraces the colonies, the national debt, the modern tax system, and the system of protection. These methods depend in part on brute force, for instance, the colonial system, but they all employ the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society, to hasten, as in a hothouse, I think is the same as a greenhouse, the process. Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, I was like, I don't think he means like a sauna. That doesn't sound. The process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalism, shorten the transition. Force is the midwife of every old society which is pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power. Now, if I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure this quote is quoted in State and Rev, as far as I know, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I mean, this is pretty much giving us a hint. I know Marx doesn't go into the state a whole bunch in Capital. You kind of get little tidbits here and there. But this is one of those tidbits where the state is basically this organized force of society, right? And in Lenin's words, he basically calls it like groups of armed men or organized groups of armed men or special groups, something like that. Similar, basically same idea. This kind of synonymizing the state with organized force and the idea that it's basically just like a giant weapon or a giant tool that is used to shorten the transition from one mode of production to another in this case, or once it has been established, it is then kind of used to just maintain the current system, protect it from agitation and so forth. Full paragraphs in a row here that are pretty solid. All right. The colonial system ripened trade and navigation as in a hothouse. Again, with that same. The companies called Monopolia, whatever, were powerful levers for the concentration of capital. Colonies provided a market for the budding manufacturers and a vast increase in accumulation for which was guaranteed by the mother country's monopoly of the market. Again, think about it, right? If you have a colony that has access to some resource, they're probably the only one who has it. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Yep, that's pretty accurate. Yeah, no, those are good points. Yeah, exactly. The state is a tool that does those things, and that was true of the capitalist transition, and it kind of remains true for a socialist transition, right? Because it has the exact same obstacles to overcome, not exact, but similar obstacles to overcome. Um, Whereas, because obviously the capitalist mode, I'm sure, had plenty of resistance from established feudal mode. Um, so yeah, yeah, exactly. I'm sure the I'm pretty sure it's even like earlier in the book, right? That like the landed aristocracy and nobility and monarchy, whatever, they're all like, of course, like super threatened by this like growing merchant class who's getting like crazy wealthy on comparable to an aristocrat. Um, and eventually that culminated in a revolution, of course. In fact, I hope I put a note. Yeah, and actually, just to rewind a bit because I actually kind of glossed over it, but um, yeah, this he quotes this dude, whatever Hodgkin. So he basically this guy is talking about the emergence of capitalism, and he says the power of the capitalist over all of the wealth of the country is a complete change in the right of property. By what law or series of laws? What is it? Was it affected? And then Marx just like roasts this dude immediately by saying the author should have reminded himself that revolutions are not made with laws, right? Like clearly, if you're still playing by the rules of the previous system, you are not doing a revolution, guys. Like, basically, Marx is saying you're a fucking clown because the way the capitalists came into power is not by following the laws. Put it that way. They basically said, "Fuck the laws, fuck the rules. We're just going to be the most like ruthless bastards of all time, basically, and accumulate wealth until we can put people to work." That's pretty much the long and short of it. Okay, back to some colonial stuff. Let's Treasures captured outside Europe by undisguised looting, enslavement, and murder flowed back to the mother country and were turned into capital there. Holland, which first brought the colonial system to its full development, already stood at the zenith of its commercial greatness in 1648. It was in almost exclusive possession of the East Indian trade, and the commerce between the southeast and the northwest of Europe. Its fisheries, its shipping, and its manufacture surpassed those of any other country. Total capital of the republic was probably greater than all the rest of Europe put together. Gulick forgets to add that the people of Holland were more overworked, poorer, and more brutally oppressed than those of all the rest of Europe put together. Well, let's see. I'll keep going here. Today, industrial supremacy brings with it commercial supremacy. In the period of manufacture, it is the reverse. Commercial supremacy produces industrial predominance, hence the preponderant role played by the colonial system at the time. It was the strange god who perched himself side by side with the old divinities of Europe on the altar, and one fine day threw them all overboard with a shove and a kick, proclaimed the making of profits as the ultimate and sole purpose of mankind. So I kind of like that little short paragraph because, again, fun allusion back to capital as a real god, right? It's like Marx just is in love with this analogy. Yep. But god damn it. Not wrong. Also interesting, I guess I'll go through this really quick because I thought it was interesting that Marx even brings this up. Because it's something we like hear about nowadays, but I guess I didn't realize it was like a thing back in the day. Which is the national debt. So he says the system of public credit, i.e., of national debts, origin of which are to be found in Genoa and Venice as early as the Middle Ages, took possession of Europe as a whole during the period of manufacture. The colonial system, with its maritime trade and commercial wars, served as a forcing house for the credit system. Thus, it first took root in Holland. The national debt, the alienation of the state, whether that state is despotic, constitutional, or republican, marked the capitalist era with its stamp. Only part so-called national wealth that actually enters into the collective possession of a modern nation is the national debt. So kind of another interesting observation, which is, I think, still mostly true, which is the fact that, like, people like to pretend like the state or the government is sort of everything's like collectivized, right? Everything supports everyone like equally and unanimously. It's like, Marx is, I think, chiding that a little bit by saying, actually, the only thing we collectively own as a people is the fucking debt. In other words, we're all expected to like just have our money basically dispossessed so we can pay off debts. And a lot of that debt is due to the state doing capital investment or like allowing capital to do its thing and like continue to grow. Okay. I don't want to go over the sections on the banks and the credit stuff too much. It's a little, I think it's a little outdated slightly because he's going all the way back to like 1694. But I mean, it's still an interesting couple paragraphs to get pressure on how banks work. Okay, yeah. This paragraph was kind of cool though, because again, this is sort of like some historical track record. For like national debts. So it says, along with the national debt, there arose an international credit system, which often conceals one of the sources of primitive accumulation, this or that people. Thus, the villainies of the Venetian system of robbery formed one of the secret foundations of Holland's wealth and capital, For Venice in her years of decadence lent large sums of money to Holland. There's a similar relationship between Holland and England. By the beginning of the 18th century, Holland's manufactures have been far outstripped. It had ceased to be the nation preponderant in commerce and industry. One of its main lines of business, therefore, from 1701 to 1776, was the lending out of enormous amounts of capital, especially to its great rival England. The same thing is going on today between England and the US. A great deal of capital, which appears today in the US without any birth certificate, was yesterday in England. Capitalized blood of children. So this is kind of interesting too. Again, just kind of doing some historical tracking of like, again, it's this question. This is the question Marx is answering in all these chapters, which is like, where the fuck did this money come from? Where the hell did all this capital like get made, basically? And yeah, he's tracking it back to like Venice doing a lot of loans back in the day. Well, and I was going to mention that like Marx is doing, I think this is like the oldest like precursor to imperialism, right? Because one of the features of capitalist imperialism that again Lenin analyzes in Imperialism is the export of capital, right? That is like one of the main features that he talks about. And now in Lenin's context, and mostly what he was focused on is sort of like, you know, remember the other aspect of capitalist imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. So clearly what Marx is analyzing is like a pre-monopoly stage, or it's on its way to getting there, right? And this little paragraph of history is like even way before that. This is like early capitalism, but I think we can already see that this pattern of like exporting capital has already been around for much longer than like the modern era of imperialism. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but it makes sense, right? Because like basically what it's saying, I think, is, you know, you look at Holland, for example, they had all this money, they were the kingpins for a little while, and they had so much money, so much capital that they literally could not exploit their own population like any more than they currently were. So what did? They export that capital to England and start investing in English, you know, or putting their operations in England, exploiting English workforce, and get, you know, jump starting industry in England basically. And then England kind of, okay, now they're starting to get fired up. They do their thing. They exploit the shit out of their people, get a huge amount of money and capital, and then what do they do with it? They export it to the United States. They export it to Australia. They export it to fucking India, like all over the place, pretty much. All right. Here, while the cotton industry introduced child slavery to England, in the United States, it gave the impulse for the transformation of the earlier, more or less patriarchal slavery into a system of commercial exploitation. In fact, the veiled slavery of wage laborers in Europe needed the unqualified slavery of the New World as its pedestal. Really, yeah, pretty interesting idea here that, again, is this is sort of again something he's doing in the last 3 or 4 chapters, is basically tying a lot of like colonial activity to the emergence of capitalism, and imagine basically like the sort of coals or embers of capitalism were kind of already like slowly smoldering and burning, but then you throw like colonialism and like the, you know, transatlantic slave trade on top of it. It's like fucking gasoline. That's sort of how I'm imagining it, and that's, I think, what this paragraph is hinting at. It's like, um, you know, it says it needed the unqualified slavery of the New World as pedestal. To me, that's basically saying like the slavery of the New World, that primitive accumulation, if you will, is like gas on the fire. It really just like got things amped up to like just an unbelievable level. Um, yeah, that's kind of the idea I'm getting from that. And then continuing here a little bit, got so great was the effort required to um, to unleash the eternal natural laws of the capitalist mode of production, to complete the process of separation between the workers and the conditions of their labor, transform at one pole the social means of production and subsistence into capital, and at the opposite pole the mass of the population into wage laborers, free laboring poor, that artificial product of modern industry. Money, according to this guy, comes into the world with a blood stain on one cheek, capital dripping from head to toe, every pore with blood and yeah, definitely a pretty good prose from Marx. He has his flashes of brilliance from here and there. But yeah, pretty like gruesome imagery basically. This idea of like, what's the genesis of industrial capitalist? Well, it's brutal. Is the short answer. It's absolutely fucking brutal. Um, Again, I sort of like glossed over some of the more nasty parts, but like Marx is really pulling out all the stops here at the end of the book, really trying to paint that image of just like the sheer brutality of early capitalist development, especially. Um, but yeah, there you go. Okay, 32. Historical tendency of capitalist accumulation. So once again, right, the idea of these chapters is to give some historical context to his previous analysis, and of course, the analysis of the general law of capitalist. Well, now he's going to give us some historical tendency for this to happen. Um, okay, so use this paragraph sort of. The private property of the worker is in his means of production, foundation of small scale industry. Small scale industry is a necessary condition for the development of social production and of the free individuality of the worker himself. Of course, this mode of production also exists under slavery, serfdom, and other situations of dependence. But it flourishes, unleashes the whole of its industry, and attains its adequate classical form only where the worker is the free proprietor, the conditions of his labor, sets them in motion himself, where the peasant owns the land he cultivates, or the artisan owns the tools with which he is an accomplished performer. So yeah, Marx is yeah, okay. But next, but yeah, Marx is basically giving us the idea of like again, this basically the first negation, which we'll get to in just a minute. But yeah, this idea of like your original private property is for like small scale industry or kind of individual workers who basically just own the products that they produce. He argues basically that this is like pretty nice. He says, oh, it like has this classical form. Does qualify it, saying like, technically this condition might be met under like other situations of dependence or aka slavery, serfdom, or whatever, but that kind of ideally this would be very nice as if we all kind of our own means of production. Wow, imagine that. All right, so just jumping ahead to the next paragraph here. So this situation basically has to be annihilated. It is annihilated and in its annihilation, the transformation of the individualized and scattered means of production, socially concentrated means of production, transformation, therefore, of the dwarf-like property of the many into the giant property of the few, and the expropriation of the great mass of the people from the soil, the means of subsistence, and from the instruments of labor, this terrible and arduously accomplished appropriation of the mass of the people forms the prehistory of capital. It comprises a whole series of forcible methods, and we have only passed in review those that have been the epoch making as methods of primitive accumulation of capital. The expropriation of the direct producers was accomplished by means of the most merciless barbarism, under the stimulus of the most infamous, most sordid, and the most petty and most odious of passions. Private property which is personally earned, i.e., which is based, as it were, on the fusing together of the isolated, independent, working individual with the conditions of his labor, is supplanted. Capitalist private property, which rests on the exploitation of alien but formerly free labor. So, yeah, just kind of hammering home this idea of, in order to get capital as a social relation started, you've gotten that step one is separate the producers from the means of production. That is like essential step. And of course, that's not something people are too keen on doing like willingly. So it involves a ton of force and violence and most odious of passions, like he says. And then I will jump ahead here because now he kind of takes the same transformation and kind of interprets it in more like a dialectic lingo here. So he says the capitalist mode of production, mode of appropriation, which springs from the capitalist mode of production, produces capitalist private property. This is the first negation of individual private property, as founded on the labor of its proprietor. But capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of a natural process, its own negation. This is the negation of the negation. It does not reestablish private property, but it does indeed establish individual property on the basis of the achievements of the capitalist era, namely cooperation, the possession of in common of the land and the means of production by labor itself. So, what does this mean? So, Marx is saying, in this previous paragraph, basically, technically, it's intermediate couple ones. They're just a little redundant. This part is the first negation. Basically, capitalism moves in. It rewrites the rules a little bit for what private property really means. And now basically means I can just appropriate somebody else's private property. But Marx is saying that, we can do a little interpretation here and basically say capitalist production begets with the inexorability of a natural process, its own negation. In other words, it has an irreconcilable internal contradiction. It's another way of putting it. And that contradiction negates the original negation. How do you negate capitalist private property? Well, what Marx suggests is it's not going back to a previous type of private property, the individual one. Right? It does not reestablish private property. We're not going backwards here. That's not what the internal contradiction actually does. Instead, what it does is ushers in cooperation and possession in common of the land and the means of production produced by labor itself. So it's just the effect of capital being concentrated and centralized. In fact, that's something that's mentioned up here, right? The idea of like hand in hand with the centralization, the expropriation of many capitals by a few. So it's like, the big fish eating the little fish. Then you've got industry developing on a greater scale or ever growing scale. You've got the growth of the cooperative form of the labor process, et cetera, et cetera. These all culminate in subverting capitalist private property, because now basically you have a workforce that is like very much conditioned to work together towards a common goal. And you've concentrated capital into these just huge titanic sums of not just money, but like resources as well, and machinery, and the the technical capability of like super large capitals is pretty astonishing, right? I mean, we're already in our modern era, of course, we're already at the point where we have private companies that send shit into space, and that's just like something they can do. I mean, I bet if we dropped Marx into the Discord call right now and we're like, dude, there's capitals that are so large right now that as a side project, mostly for fun, but like also for government contracts, there are just like commercial enterprises that make rockets and send it up into space. You'd probably be like, yep, that sounds about right. Like just absolutely absurd amount of like technical development is possible when you have a tremendous access to resources. But again, like we should understand, and from the rest of the text, and also he's giving us a lot of hints here, basically, that like this is it's like that other quote that Marx I don't think it's from Capital necessarily, maybe it is, but the idea of like, capitalism produces above all else its own grave diggers, right? Like ultimately one of its greatest achievements is building a massive proletariat of like very like talented, well-trained workers that are all like highly coordinated, at least within a productive process. But Marx is basically suggesting like, why couldn't they just be coordinated without the capitalists? Like, what's wrong with that? I'll just do the last little paragraph here. It's pretty short. The transformation of scattered private property resting on the personal labor of the individuals themselves into capitalist private property is naturally an incomparably more protracted, violent, and difficult process than the transformation of capitalist private property, which in fact already rests on the carrying on of production by society into social property. So, social property is sort of like, in this context, would be like the new social relation, right? So we've got like private property, or I guess to distinguish it, individual private property, capitalist private property, and now social property. Social property is the one that all of us are interested in, which is basically just collective ownership of the production, of course. In the former case, it was a matter of the expropriation of the mass of the people by a few usurpers. But in this case, we have the expropriation of a few usurpers by the mass of the people. There's the inversion, right? There's the, yeah, that's the second negation. We're flipping it on its head. Now the mass of the people are hopefully going to usurp the usurpers and, turn all the private property into social property. All right, last go here. Again, this I don't know if I guess I said this right before the recording, but like this chapter just felt like Marx was right about wrapped up, ready to send it off to Engels for a quick skim, and then he must have read this motherfucker's paper or something. This Wakefield dude, because Marx obviously felt so strongly about it that he had to add one more fucking chapter to Capital, despite, in my opinion, the end of chapter 32 being a really nice narrative stopping point. Like, you know what I mean? It just makes so much more sense to end on 32, to be like, hey, well, is that, I mean, it's not 50, it's like 20, but yeah, I get what you're saying. It's just like, dude, you ended on like, you could have ended on, this is how capitalism, arose as a social relation, and like all we got to do is invert the social relation once again, and it's like leaving on an optimistic note, right? Like this is the mission of socialists, basically, is to expropriate the expropriators, right? And Marx is just like, or I guess I even skipped over this part, which is, or arguably, just put, yeah, just put chapter 33 into volume 3. Volume 3 is like a mishmash of all kinds of stuff. And yeah, I didn't highlight this. Probably should have. I think that's actually what my note technically started on. Um, but yeah, the expropriators are expropriated. Again, that's another classic Marx quote. But yeah, that's like, to me, the narrative conclusion of the text is sort of this idea of like, these guys are all bastards, especially the old school capitalists who got the ball rolling are like the most bastardly of all bastards, and all we got to do is fuck them over and take all their stuff, and because it should be everyone's stuff. That's pretty much the gist of it. But instead, we're going to do a quick like review of what Marx thinks about colonization, because he has been talking about it as a part of the primitive accumulation process. So, all right, we'll see what he has to say about it. All right, so he immediately, again, points out this distinction between the two different kinds of private property, one of which rests on the labor of the producer himself, and the other on the exploitation of the labor of others. The political economists forget that the latter is not only the direct antithesis of the former, but it grows on the former's tomb and nowhere else. I'll skip this one real quick, but he says, focusing on the colonies here, there the capitalist regime constantly comes up against the obstacle presented by the producer, who, as an owner of his own conditions of labor, employs that labor to enrich himself instead of the capitalist. The contradiction between these two diametrically opposed economic systems has its practical manifestation here in the struggle between them. Where the capitalist has behind him the power of the mother country, he tries to use force to clear out of the way modes of production and appropriation which rest on the personal labor of the independent producer. The same interest which, in the mother country, compels the sycophant of capital, the political economist, to declare that the capitalist mode of production is theoretically its own opposite. The same interest in the colonies drives him to make a clean breast of it and to proclaim aloud the antagonism between the two modes. So he's dispelling this idea right out the gate, which he basically already just did. But again, there's a difference between producers producing for themselves and producers producing for a capitalist, right? Shitting on the political economists like Wakefield for suggesting they're the same exact thing. Okay, what does it say? We are dealing here with true colonies, i.e., virgin soil colony immigrants. The United States is, economically speaking, still a colony of Europe. Apart from this, old plantations where the abolition of slavery has completely revolutionized early relationships also belong. Okay. Yeah, I guess in like, yeah, you're right. Right. I guess. Hmm. Would that be what Lenin calls a semi-colony? Right, where they're like, on paper they're politically independent, but they're sort of economically dependent. Maybe that's what Marx is trying to suggest, just with the different Different terminology. Yeah. Yeah, no, I guess. Hey, you know what? If Marx is not a fan of America, that's yeah, I guess I didn't notice that one. That's pretty. That's kind of funny. There's some funny ones. Okay, so let's figure out what the fuck Wakefield's talking about. All right. First of all, Wakefield discovered that in the colonies, property in money, means of subsistence, machines, and other means of production does not as yet stamp a man as a capitalist if the essential complement to these things is missing, the wage laborer, the other man who is compelled to sell himself of his free will. He discovered that capital is not a thing, but a social relation between persons which is mediated through things. So that's so he's basically, I mean, maybe slightly mocking the guy, which is sort of like, bro, I already like published this shit before, dumbass. But um, classic Marx citing himself here. Um, but yeah, like that's one of the most important kind of like takeaways from this text. Like if you take away one thing, try to take away this that capital is not necessarily, I would say, asterisk, it's not necessarily a thing, but it is a social relation between persons which is mediated through things. That's a really good way of putting it. And he's basically saying like Wakefield discovered what I've already known for fucking years. So like, get on my level, dude. Um, so that's kind of cool. But Wakefield is pointing out basically that just because you have capital basically doesn't make you a capitalist automatically, because really what you need is a wage labor produce stuff for you. Okay, so moving on. For the understanding of the following discoveries of Wakefield, let us make two preliminary remarks. We know that the means of production and subsistence, while they remain the property of the immediate producer, are not capital. They only become capital under circumstances in which they serve at the same time as means of exploitation of and domination over the worker. But this, their capitalist soul, is so intimately wedded in the mind of the political economist to their material substance that he christens them capital under all circumstances, even where they are its exact opposite. Thus it is with Wakefield. Further, he describes the splitting up of the means of production into the individual property of many mutually independent and self-employed workers as an equal division of capital. The political economist is like the feudal jurist who used to attach the labels supplied by feudal law even to relationships which were purely monetary. I don't even really understand that last section, that last sentence. I'm sure he's referring to something specific. But basically, what he's criticizing Wakefield for is like, it's the classic, right? Being deceived by the appearance of a thing instead of like what is really behind the curtain. So focusing on like the material substance of capital and being like, yeah, well, the material is that's what capital is. It's machines, it's raw materials, it's tools. Marx is saying, no, that's not capital until it's put to work by wage laborers who are being exploited by the owner of those means of production. That would be, now it's capital, right? That exploitation is kind of built in into the definition of capital. You can't really separate the two. Because if you have a bunch of capital that's all owned by the populace, evenly, right? This equal division of capital. Marx is like, well, that ain't capital, son. That would be social property, right? Totally different purpose. Um, yeah, pretty cool. Yeah, yeah, I think so. That's like I said. I'm sure there's a specific thing he's referencing, like a specific instance of someone using like feudal law to like argue for something capitalism based. I don't know. Like I figured that was what he was referencing, but I was like, I don't know. There's no footnote on that one either, so I was like, whatever. It's the first chunk, first chunk of the paragraph, which really matters. So anyway. Um. All right. So general again, some of his. I'm gonna skim through some of it, but some of the idea for Marx of like what colonialism is about is sort of expanding your potential workforce as well as your access to materials and so forth. But there's like this aspect to it which mostly criticizing Wakefield for sort of missing, which is it also involves the um, reproduction of the capital relation, right? Capital as a social relation. That's also what needs to be invented in the colonies. And so, one way he puts this, something down here. No wonder Wakefield laments the absence of both relations of dependence, feelings of dependence on the part of wage laborers in the colonies. On account of the high wages, says his disciple, there is in the colonies an urgent desire for cheaper and more subservient workers, for a class of people to whom the capitalist may dictate his terms instead of having his terms dictated by them. In the old civilized countries, the worker, although free, is by a law of nature dependent on the capitalist. In the colonies, this dependence must be created by artificial means. Um, Artificial here again implying very violent and forceful, most likely. But in his chitter chatter in here about like America as a colony, for example, because I think that's why he puts that footnote in, by the way, because he does like talk about America a lot as like a colonial project, which is not totally wrong, right? I mean, it's a settler colonial project at least. Um, it just again, Marx isn't using that language, but we understand that to be the case. Yeah, yeah, for sure. And of course, like the colonization of like the entire North American continent was a pretty arduous process. Like obviously, it took a while, right? And it's incredibly violent as it proceeded. Um, so I kind of get. Honestly, it's funny. Like reflecting back on that footnote, one, it like Marx isn't totally wrong. Um, Again, like he wasn't very specific because it's like, well, yes, America was like politically independent basically, but the process of them colonizing the actual like territory, that in that sense I feel like America was technically still a colony. It was growing and expanding and colonizing land. In that sense, he's not wrong, because that did take a while. Um, but there's kind of, again, I'm kind of glossing over some of it, but the gist is basically that when you do have a lot of not free land necessarily, but like a lot of land for your peasants to spread out, such that like they aren't being coerced to be factory workers, right? Um, I think here, maybe I should just go for it because I think what Wakefield, yeah, actually, you know what? I'll just think it'll explain it pretty well. Okay, how then can the anti-capitalist cancer of the colonies be healed? And now remember what Marx means by anti-capitalist in this context. What he means is that in a colony, especially in the American context of like a settler colony, where you've got a bunch of people who are like actively settling land and sort of they're being given plots of land by the government or whatever. Those types of people are actually like more difficult to exploit from the capitalist perspective because they already have like they have essentially everything they need in natural resources. Yes, they have to build and make and harvest all the stuff themselves, but like they're more than willing to do that, right? Especially since a lot of them were immigrants from Europe and were probably fleeing that very situation in the first place. It's sort of like, oh yeah, let's go to America, like the promised land where we can be settlers and just have a huge plot of land to ourselves and we don't have to deal with any capital. In some ways, you can mildly empathize with them, be like, yeah, okay, I get why you would want to be like self-reliant once again if you came from like a super shit context in England or something. But he frames this as being like anti-capitalist in the sense of like not ideal for capital. Anyways, let's see what he says about it. If men were willing to turn the whole of the land from public into private property at one blow, this would certainly destroy the root of the evil, but it would also destroy the colony. The trick is to kill two birds with one stone. Let the government set an artificial price on the virgin soil, a price independent of the law of supply and demand, and a price that compels the immigrant to work for a long time for wages, before he can earn enough money to buy the land and turn himself into an independent farmer. The fund resulting from the sale of the land at a price relatively prohibitory for the wage laborers, this fund of money extorted from the wages of labor by violation of the sacred law of such man, is to be applied by the government in proportion to the importation of paupers from Europe into the colonies, so as to keep the wage labor market full for the capitalists. For these circumstances, everything will be for the best in the best of all possible worlds. This is the great secret of systematic colonization. So, this is it's like almost like a mustache twirling evil genius type plan, but this is what they came up with, right? Instead of just giving land to the peasants, the immigrants, and the settlers, we're actually going to sell it to them, and we're going to sell it to them at a absurdly high price. And when he says like they're violating law of supply and demand, think about it. The United States was like actively clearing out and genociding native land, essentially. So you've got this huge supply of land, huge supply. And the demand was also quite high. But the supply was like absolutely enormous. So if you were obeying the law of supply and demand, the land would be cheap because you've got a lot of it. What he's saying is you should violate that. and actually make the land way more expensive than it probably should be. And what that achieves is that not only do you have like a source of revenue for your government, um, but on top of that, when you do have the immigrants come over from Europe, and remember they're basically flat broke usually, but they get over to America and they're like, wow, I could buy land if I just work a wage job for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. Sounds like a deal. It's a good way of like basically trapping people into wage labor as soon as they get off the boat, in with sort of like the promise of buying land in America. All the while, you use the money in that fund to import even more paupers and pay for people from Europe to come over in droves. Which, again, remember, what are the capitalists looking for? They need an industrial reserve army. You got to have some excess population that are not employed and not independent farmers, right? Because if they just brought a bunch of peasants and paupers over and just gave them all plots of land and were like, okay, have fun being a farmer, there's no reason for them to like work in a factory. There just isn't. They've already got it made in the shade, basically. So what Wakefield suggests is like, yeah, like we need to basically fuck over these, peasants and paupers that are coming over from Europe and almost like bait them. Like we need to bait them over here with the promise of land, but really we're actually just going to put them to work immediately. It's super fucking scummy. It's like such a like, I don't know. It almost makes me smile, like just how ruthlessly evil that plan is. But there you go. Yeah, that's sort of like the economic conditions of vision, especially in a capitalist context, by the way. All right, just to go over, might as well cover the last paragraph because that's part of the. So let's do it. However, we are not concerned here with the conditions of the colonies. Only thing that interests us is the secret discovered in the New World by the political economy of the Old World, loudly proclaimed by it. That the capitalist mode of production and accumulation, therefore capitalist private property as well, have for their fundamental condition the annihilation of that private property which rests on the labor of the individual himself. In other words, the expropriation of the worker. Kind of a weird ending because he's sort of saying, I know I wrote an entire chapter on colonization, but I'm not too worried about that. It's like, we're not concerned about that here. Then why'd you put it in the damn book, you goofball? I don't know, but yeah. All right, that's pretty much that's it for volume 1. Obviously, some appendices and all that fun stuff, but we're not going to do that. Yeah. We did it, folks. Clap, clap, clap. What is Mayome? Uh, yes, we finished longest book we'll probably ever read. Yeah. Yeah, no kidding. Next week. Oh, I have no clue. Free officially. And there's also the Grundrisse, which is like it's like part volume 0. It's like 14. Is it 14 total that were like planned? Hmm. Yeah, I'll probably take you up on that at some point. Yeah, because I will be, well, if scheduling goes well, I'll be traveling quite a bit for the rest of the summer. Let's see, but that might mean Mondays will become more and more compromised as we go. So we'll see. Yep, yep. Yeah, I mean, obviously next Monday I'm also going to be traveling, which is why the week off is I. Yeah, no, I'm also just glad to be done with reading this book because like it definitely became more and more like a chore every week where I was like, oh, okay, I gotta put like a few hours aside to like because to I don't know it as we went on it felt more and more like studying where I was like, yeah, I mean basically you're reading our textbook essentially, so you're like, okay, I can't just like sit down, crack open the book, and like vibe with it and be like, yeah, I like this. It's because like yeah, like I like reading for just the entertainment of it, the enjoyment of it. Um, and yeah, this it has its moments, obviously, but the bulk of it is, you know, exhausting and just you got to just push through it. Oh my god, yeah. I'm already the type of person who is reading like 3 to 4 books simultaneously at any given time. I just kind of rotate between them, but having like I don't know, having like one book in the pile for 6 fucking months is like torture because you're just like, you're just dragging the other books down. Like, yeah, well, that's why the book club is like it works. It works at what it's supposed to do, which is to get us to read the fucking book. Because like that, I will say it was successful because I mean, the first time I tried reading Capital like solo, I think when I hit chapter 10 is when I quit. And looking back, I understand why I did now because I'm like, yeah, chapter 10 is just like Mark's venting over like factory reports for like umpteen pages. And I was like, I can't take this anymore. It's, like, I get it, dude. The factory sucked ass back in the day. Like, I get it. But that's the thing, right? That's why you just got to power through those like long historical context chapters and sometimes the analysis ones also get pretty dry, but yeah. True. I will say that did help. I actually did second time around, which is this time. I did use the audiobook. Um, I don't even think I like read chapter 10 is like with my I just listened to it because I knew what to expect. I already kind of knew the gist of chapter 10. I was like, yeah, let's just put it on like a really long podcast. Like a 3-hour podcast basically. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think I listened to it a few nights in a row like while making dinner. It was like, all right, yeah, this is kind of a banger. Yeah. Yeah, I found quickly that I couldn't really do that with some of the more like analysis heavy chapters because those are the ones I have to study, right? Those are the ones I when I read it, I'm like, no, this is like a textbook. Like I gotta reread certain sentences and like really try and internalize things. Whereas if it's all historical, I'm like, ah, just like a big story, basically.